And before I make introductions, we will turn the gathering over to Denise, our associate pastor, who will be praying with us this morning.
Please join me in prayer. Gracious and holy God, we thank you for the beauty of this day, that the fall weather is inviting and invigorating and reminds us of transitions as we realize in our own lives that there are also transitions. And so we give thanks for those who have joined the cloud of witnesses for their lives, for Becky Meredith and for Hazel Garani. And then we thank you for this time that we have in adult ed to learn new things and to see how we can apply it to our lives. And so we thank you for this gathering and ask that you would open our hearts and minds to receive what you would have us to have today. All these things we ask in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
As we begin, I will ask one more housekeeping favor. As Janine begins to present, if you could mute yourself and then unmute it at the time that you might have questions. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Janine Smith. Janine is a Lakota descendant. She's an enrolled citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation, particular Arikara. I'm saying she'll be explaining a little more. And she's also an accomplished archivist with the Loyola University in New Orleans. And she's been recognized nationally for her documentation of land ownership. And we'll be talking about what her work has uncovered about our relationship with the indigenous peoples around us. And we'll be talking about how we might be able to restore and heal the relationships that we'll be hearing about. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you, Janine. Thank you so much for being with us on this Indigenous Peoples Weekend.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Inhani washte, lila wopila, wichapi wakashka yuza, imachiapi. Good morning, and I thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you. My name is Janine Smith. As Carol mentioned, I am the University Archivist and Special Collections Registrar at Loyola University, New Orleans. And I would like to start this morning by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples in the lands we now call Bethesda, Maryland, and New Orleans, Louisiana, though I recognize that we have people joining in from all over. But I acknowledge and seek to honor the Acohannock Indian tribe, the Assateague Peoples tribe, the Nasue Wash Band of Indians, and the Piscataway Kanoi Confederacy, the Cedarville Band of the Piscataway Indians, the Paukamuck Indian Nation, and the Uongini River Band of Shawnee Indians, the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, Homa, and all tribal nations who have been historically erased and displaced from their ancestral lands. I stand in solidarity and support with these nations, and I hope by educating others about land acknowledgements and Native issues that I am honoring these nations with my words and actions. And I will say this, as I'm going through, you can hear that I'm, mucking my way through pronunciations. As a Native person, it's okay. We understand these names are hard to say, but it's just the attempt is appreciated. So I would like to take a moment to honor my mother. I stand here by myself, but I didn't get here by myself. And she taught me what it is to be a strong Arikara and Lakota woman. And she was an advocate for Indigenous issues, specifically in the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, and was a water protector of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And she's the reason that I'm here today. I have, you know, I've tried to pick up her torch and in advocating for Indigenous peoples and their rights and issues. So this is our agenda for today. I'll speak a little bit about my work with land acknowledgements and how we can make them more actionable instead of performative. And we'll talk a little bit about where to begin, what to consider. And I will go through important issues to Native communities, and then we will talk about the history of Indian residential boarding schools. We'll talk a little bit about archival material and some additional resources. And if you have questions, I'm very much open and I welcome them. So to give you a little bit of a background about myself, I'm a wife, I'm a mom of three. I was born and raised just north of New Orleans. And as I mentioned, that I'm the university archivist at Loyola, and my background is in secondary education, and I hold a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Southern Mississippi. And I will make this disclaimer that I am not formally educated in Indigenous history, but I do bring to you my own personal history and personal experiences, stories. And this PowerPoint, as you can see, will include personal pictures, and I'll share personal anecdotes as we go along. But as Carol had mentioned, I'm a Lakota descendant, specifically the Cheyenne River tribe. And I'm an enrolled citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, but specifically the Arikara tribe. And that they're also known as the three affiliated tribes. They essentially, just with displacement and dwindling numbers, banded together. So that's why they are the three affiliated tribes. I'm maternally Lakota, and I'm sorry, on my great-grandmother's side, Lakota, and on my great-grandfather's side, Arikara. And this picture that you see here is an image of the 4 generations of women in my family. And it was taken in the early 90s, I believe. It was a newspaper article that was written about my family. And I believe I was about 3 years old here in this picture. So to give you some geographical context, my great-grandmother was born at Fort Yates on the Standing Rock Reservation, which is down here at the bottom. I can't really see exactly. I've got my share screen bar in the way, but Fort Yates should be down here somewhere. And so that is, that's still considered what we call North Dakota today. And then up the river here, up the Missouri River, this is the Fort Berthold Reservation. And oops, let me go back. And that is where my great-grandfather was born. It's Elbow Woods, which is one of the few communities. It's down here in the southern part of the reservation that is no longer in existence. It was flooded when they constructed the Garrison Dam in the 50s. And if you're wondering how I ended up in New Orleans, believe it or not, was not due to displacement. These are my great-grandparents. This is my great-grandmother, Amelia Fern Jones, and my great-grandfather, William Jones. And they live very interesting lives. I wish I had a lot more context about my family than what I do. I'll talk a little bit about, my history and some of the things I've been doing with genealogy to try and learn more about my family's history. But yes, to say, my great-grandfather was a minister at one point in time. I can't remember if he was Baptist or Episcopalian, and I'll talk a little bit why I have conflicting memories of that. But I actually didn't meet him. He died before I was born. But he worked for American Airlines, and they traveled all over the country. They lived in Chicago for a while. They settled in Oklahoma for several years, and then finally settled in New Orleans. And my mother she was born and raised in Owasso, which is just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But she followed them down to New Orleans, and that is that's the history of how I came to be here. But what I'll do is describe in the coming slides, describe experiences with boarding schools and how, the goal of boarding schools essentially was to eradicate Indigenous culture. And what I love about this picture is that it is evidence of that did not work. And, you see my grandparents here in full regalia, and it's just a testament to cultural resilience. This photo was taken in the 80s. So I will make another little disclaimer here. I won't speak on behalf of Native peoples, but I will share various viewpoints as they have been presented in voice in our communities. And in addition to our family traditions, as I mentioned, I will talk a little bit about my personal experiences. So this is, me coming to you today, and what I've learned from the matriarchs of my family. But in addition to that, we talked a little bit about how I'm here in New Orleans, but my parents divorced when I was little, and my mother moved to the Cherokee Reservation, which is in North Carolina. It's due west of Asheville, which, as we know, as we were talking about hurricanes, has also been very disrupted. But the Cherokee Reservation is just west of Asheville. It's about an hour over the mountain from Gatlinburg, Tennessee, just to give you an idea of where that's located. But yes, so I'll talk a little bit about my experiences there. My brother and sister still live there today, and I'll talk a little bit about personal stories and things as we move along in terms of my family history, and I'm open to any questions that you may have too. But the point is that these topics that we'll talk about, how they really are relevant and they touch so many Indigenous lives. A lot of that intergenerational trauma is still felt today. And, some of the things that we talk about do make us uncomfortable, even in church settings, as we continue to educate ourselves, things can be a bit uncomfortable, but I do think it's important to lean into that discomfort and to learn from these feelings and experiences. So we'll talk a little bit about land acknowledgements. This is where a large part of my scholarship comes from. And you did hear me present to you a land acknowledgement a few moments ago. They have been around for quite a while, but have really gained traction in recent years. And if you're not familiar with what they are and what purpose they serve, they are statements that have intentions of recognizing past and present Indigenous peoples of a particular location, but especially in reference to their enduring relationship between the Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. So I first encountered a land acknowledgement at a conference a couple of years ago, and I was serving on a board of that organization. And at first I was really proud and excited to be a part of a group that had the forethought to include a land acknowledgement. And when it came time to the day of the forum, I felt there was just something awkward about it when I was speaking the words. It felt, it just felt awkward, and I couldn't really pinpoint what it was I was feeling at that time. And then a short while later, I came across this image that you see here on your left, that this was, I guess, put on social media by an author, Angeline Bully. She is an Ojibwe author, and she said, land acknowledgements are often moving but rarely impactful. And it really kind of hit the nail on the head for me. I was like, okay, yes, this is what I'm feeling. It's the words are there, but what impact does it serve? And so, and as you see, I have two images of the books up here, and what you'll see throughout this presentation is I'll include different resources, but also different suggestions and materials that you may want to encounter or interact with, moving forward. These two novels are, they're geared towards young adults, but I really, really did enjoy reading them. Firekeeper's Daughter is kind of a coming of age story. And then Warrior Girl Unearthed is it focuses more heavily on Indigenous issues like the missing and murdered women epidemic, as well as repatriation of human remains and funeral sacred objects. All right. So, the thing with land acknowledgements is that we want to promote social justice and to be more equitable and inclusive in the work that we do and in the communities that we serve. But when we do these land acknowledgements, sometimes as institutions, we can kind of become complacent in our efforts, and we have good intentions, but we can become performative without realizing it. So, so what I'd like to talk about these land acknowledgements is if your institution is interested, or the various organizations, even outside of, outside of the church. I'll give you some tips on how we can do that moving forward. And if you have any questions at any point in time, if you want to have a consultation, I'm happy to do that. But I do think it's important to talk about these land acknowledgements, because what's being voiced within Native communities is that, there's mixed feelings there, that it's the intention is good, but without thoughtful word choice to Native peoples, it can sound like we're no longer here, that it can be a grim reminder of violence, genocide, and land that was once theirs has been seized by colonial powers. And as I mentioned, the trauma, the intergenerational trauma and the aftermath is still felt in families today. And with that said, land acknowledgements, I believe, are important, and it's a way to confront institutional legacies as agents of colonialism. But this is a starting point. So if you're interested in creating a land acknowledgement, a few things to consider to begin with: self-reflection. Ask yourself, why am I creating this? How do I update it to include actions and concrete ways to support in Native communities? And this is part of the discussion here, right? That we want to learn how to help heal and support Native communities in our relationships with the Indigenous peoples of our area. And as you are writing these land acknowledgements, what do you hope the audience will do after hearing or reading it? So in the process, don't agonize over the wording. Action is what is important. Outline concrete steps and state what you as an individual or an organization commit to doing. And these land acknowledgements can be done at conferences. I've seen it in various forms. People put them on their organization's website. Sometimes they put it in the signature of their emails. So these are just a couple of places that you may want to consider if this is something that you're looking at pursuing. And perhaps the most important piece to consider is building authentic relationships. As we move forward and want to educate ourselves, it's really important to do that research of past and present nations in your area, and to reach out directly to local Indigenous communities and ask how they want to be acknowledged. What can you do to specifically help and support? What projects are they working on, and what are their goals for the future? How you can make a direct impact. And I won't speak again for each nation or community, but I believe that if it's done in a good way, that communities are open to that help and support. But it should be said that, based on past experiences and emotional labor and the history, be prepared to hear the word no on occasion. It's that should be respected as well. But if you do plan to reach out to Native communities, please do your work and research ahead of time. The tribe should be consulted. If you're wanting to do a land acknowledgement, and consult the tribe for their approval, and this should be on a consultation basis only. And it's important to keep in mind that if you do end up meeting with Native nations, it's important to bring gifts to the elders, to present to elders, and do your research there as well as to what is appropriate for those meetings. Okay, so we're going to transition into the important issues and areas where you can provide support. So we'll talk a little bit about honoring sovereignty. And in order to do that, we need to talk about land treaties. And I'm sure that you're aware that that without knowing offhand, I think it's about 5% of tribal nations retained their ancestral lands. So this map kind of demonstrates those land holdings across both hemispheres actually here in this image. But after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States government and military really zeroed in on Indigenous peoples. And you'll see around this time a great number, and some of you here, historians in the room, may have some ideas on this too, but you really see a great number of these treaties being written in conjunction with the War of Extermination, which was the thought really to exterminate Indigenous peoples as a part of westward expansion and in essence, gaining control of the land. And so, for example, you'll see with the treaties like the Fort Laramie Treaty and the Dawes Act, what these treaties did were they regulated land rights in specifically territories for the Lakota people. And of course, there are treaties for tribes all across the United States. But these land treaties essentially would give Lakota families land allotments instead of communally owning the land, which is in really complete opposition with the nomadic way of life and the Lakota understanding of the world and the way that we interact with other beings in every aspect of the natural world. So, and also to point out here that in addition to these treaties and protections that were supposed to provide support, they were largely ignored. And so that brings us back to sovereignty. If you're not familiar with sovereignty it's a complicated legal concept. It refers to the nation's right to self-govern, and it includes many rights, but the important part here is that it is in part of federal Indian law, which pertains to tribal land claims, and that can be difficult to document because it's largely reliant on these treaties and and as you know, those treaties have been broken. But if we are looking at land acknowledgements in terms of the sovereignty, in the scope of sovereignty, we should stand in solidarity is the point. And I appreciate the Indigenous land and territorial acknowledgements for Institute Project. And what they say is that mission statements that we should move from rhetoric to action, and that land acknowledgements are not land back. They are points of reckoning, resistance, and for activation. But you've probably maybe heard of land back, and land back is very different. It's really returning land to Indigenous peoples, but it can be other things such as college land back or free tuition for Indigenous peoples. It can be things like land-based reparations and honor taxes, which are voluntary land taxes that like essentially a donation of funding to Indigenous communities. All right. And what else to consider? Insensitive and harmful behaviors. Consider any behaviors that might be insensitive or harmful in terms of language that's being used, stereotypes. I'm sure you've encountered, Halloween costumes that, you see like a native headdress or like a woman in like a, I guess a revealing native costume. And these, these aren't costumes. It's, it's our culture. And, these sort of things we are trying to correct and educate and explain how, these stereotypes and appropriations are harmful. And if you see at the bottom of the screen, there's a link that gives 100 ways to support and not appropriate from Indigenous peoples. And the links and everything that I have here, I will make sure to get to Carol if you're interested in looking at some of this material further.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely. And read and support Indigenous authors. Angeline Bully, who I mentioned before, she was a keynote speaker at the Association of American Indian Affairs Repatriation Conference last year. And she ended her talk by saying, it's one thing that you can do that is really impactful is to engage with Indigenous authors. It doesn't take anything to get a book from the library. It doesn't take money to write a review or to pass a book recommendation to a colleague or a friend. And that can be a significant impact in the way that it's a tangible way to help Native writers tell their stories, to take back our narratives and have our voices heard. So I have a couple examples here. And at the end, I'm going to show you, I have an online resource that's very graphics and visual, that has a large list of recommendations in terms of books and different things. So I'll share that with you as well. And some other crucial issues, language revitalization, as you heard me speak at the very beginning. Let's see, how am I doing on time? I am not fluent in the Lakota language at all, but there are a lot of ways that Indigenous peoples are working to make this happen as our populations get smaller and as our elders are no longer with us. We run the risk of losing these languages. I think in a recent statistic that came from UNESCO, I think there are like 75 native languages that are on the verge of extinction. And I think like on my Arikara side, I read a statistic, and I don't know if this is accurate, but that there are only 3 born native speakers left that can speak fluently. And so there's a lot of work that's being done. We've come a long way with technology. There's some apps out there that have really been helping me learn the Lakota language. And I guess I should point out here too that with the passing of my mom a couple years ago, that's kind of it. It's myself and my siblings, and it's really hard to be able to get our stories and to learn our history. I should have written it down when I had the chance, and I guess that's one of those life lessons, right? Like, let's not put off the things tomorrow that we should be doing today. But yeah, so another important issue is this missing and murdered women, girl, Two-Spirit, which is our LGBTQ community. But because it's such a pervasive issue, I've lately been seeing missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. This is what the R stands for. There's a lot of shocking statistics in terms of violence, really, especially against women and girls, but really to all Indigenous peoples, for a number of reasons. But it's a crisis, and there are plenty of organizations out there that are working to try and fix this, to try and understand this, why this happens. Repatriation, I know this probably isn't very relevant here with this specific group here, but repatriation is the taking back of ancestral remains, funeral objects, sacred objects, and a lot of our universities and museums hold these materials and people, and they need to go back to their home for proper burial. So there's a lot of work that's being done now currently, especially with the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act as a legislative act to try and to get these materials back home. And the Indian Welfare Act, that is receiving a lot of attention recently because the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of siding with Native families, giving them preferential treatment in custody cases. Largely Native children would have been placed in families outside of their own race. And again, that's part of this whole separation of culture. And then lastly, again, this kind of aligns with our land acknowledgements that, consider your personal relationship to the earth and to the land that you live on, and how can we make the world, essentially a better place? How can we, work with our water sources? How can we, really affect the earth for good and make positive change? So there are a lot of initiatives, I'm sure, everywhere that you can get involved with. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to the issue of boarding schools. And as I'd mentioned, there, was, I guess maybe, I don't even know if the history books would necessarily call it this, but it was it was a war of extermination. That the point was to get rid of Native peoples, and that was followed by a war of assimilation, and that's where you see the boarding school situation arise. You may have heard of Captain Richard Henry Pratt. He was infamously known for saying, "Kill the Indian and save the man." And so that is where these boarding schools start to take off kind of after this war of extermination. And if you see here, this is a really famous photo. I believe this is in the 1890s in Michigan. It's what you're looking at are thousands of buffalo skulls, which was, that's a large food source for the Great Plains peoples. And, by killing off the buffalo for just their hides and like maybe their tongues, and leaving the rest of the bodies to rot, that's a food source. And, sorry, these topics get really, really heavy when you think about it, but that's what you see here in this image. And we're going to transition now into boarding schools. So if you aren't familiar, boarding schools, there, I believe, are about 500 in the United States, not including Canada. And of these 523, I think is the number, but there's some are still, I mean, I'm sure the number can fluctuate a little bit, but about over 400 of these schools received federal funding from the government. And the schools themselves were either run by the government or run by religious institutions. And so I think that, well, we'll talk a little bit about some of them. Some of the most infamous ones that I'm sure you've heard of are Carlisle, which is in Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned, Captain Pratt, he secured the funding to, he got some congressional funding to form Carlisle. It was a army barracks that they transformed into a school. And the number of students, I've seen a couple different numbers. I believe it's either going to be about 7,000 or 10,000 students that have come through Carlisle. And I have personal connections there, so we'll talk a little bit more about those just in a few minutes. But essentially what would happen in these boarding schools is that children as young as 4 would be taken from their families and brought to these schools to assimilate them into mainstream culture, to white culture. And as I mentioned, to kill the Indian and to save, save the child. This is the part that gets difficult. It's a lot of times what would happen is families would be forced to give up their children, like even legally sign away their custody rights to their own children. Parents who did not comply with this could be jailed. They would, and this is the part that I don't have a whole lot of knowledge as to why this happens. I'm sure there's a reason for this, but governments would use Native people to serve as truancy officers, to serve as superintendents. This is all part of like the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They would have their own people be a part of the system. And I have a personal story here. My sister gave me the permission to share this with you, but my sister lives on the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina, and her great-grandfather was a truancy officer for one of these residential schools. And she shared with me that her grandfather had actually tried to run away from this school, and his own father had to take him back. So, it's again, a lot of trauma there, a lot of intergenerational and interfamily traumas that have come from this as well. So, sorry, this picture is a little bit blurry. I didn't think it was going to be as blurry here. I wish I could give you better context for this picture, but this is a personal family photograph. I don't know where this is. I imagine it is in the Dakota somewhere. And it's hard to say, exactly if I believe this to be a boarding school photo, but I don't have a lot of context for this. Like, as I mentioned, my family, once I lost my mom, that's kind of where the family histories stopped. And I was very, very close with my great grandmother. She died when I was like maybe 9 years old. But, when you're young like that, these aren't really the stories that you want to tell your grandchildren. And I think we're seeing that a lot, is that um, residential boarding school survivors have a really hard time talking about their experiences. But it is slowly changing, and I think, it's important that their voices be heard in these issues. So let's see. So this is a still shot, I guess you say. This comes from the TV series Reservation Dogs. That I will give you, this is one of my top recommendations. It's a show that's produced on FX, but you can stream it on Hulu. Reservation Dogs follows the story of 4 teenagers in Oklahoma. It is incredibly funny, but it is probably, and it's an entirely indigenous cast, and an almost entirely indigenous like writing team and production team. So this is like kind of one of the first of its kind, and really, really lovely show. But it gives the most accurate portrayal of what contemporary Native life is like. But what you see here is it's a flashback episode, and it is showing this young girl here on the left. It's her experience at a boarding school. And when students first arrived at these schools, they would usually take a picture in their traditional regalia. That's what they showed up, got off the train on. They would take a picture in those in their clothing, in their regalia, and those clothes would be taken from them and burned. And then you would see the after photos of them in their new school uniforms. But what also happened, again, if you're not familiar with this process, Native students would be changed into clothes. They'd be doused with lye. And in this image here, they have their haircut. And let's see if I can speak without getting a little emotional here, but your hair for Native people, like we have, long hair is it's another connection. It's an extension of your body. It's a connection, a further connection to the natural world. And for most Native people, and this is not everybody, things change obviously over time, but traditionally you don't cut your hair. And like in the Lakota culture, you won't, the only times that you do cut your hair are in times of mourning. And so it's just not something that's done. And what's really powerful about this image here is when they're filming this boy that's getting his hair cut, they are actually cutting his hair for the scene. And it was a really powerful moment on set, apparently very emotional. But the boy believed that it needed to be done to kind of show the weight of, just how, just how traumatic this was for Native people. And let's see. So some other things, students were confined to a lot of hard labor, and were expected to learn, domestic duties, sewing, cooking. And then the other piece to this is like the physical activity. Yes, there were a lot of sports, and I'm sure, sure there was some good that came of it. But when I see the images of students boxing, it's traumatic, because at face value, it just looks like students, exercising or participating in sports. But really what's happening is that students were boxing. They were pitted up against each other to try and further separate them from their culture, from connecting with other students. It's it's heavy. It's students were punished for speaking their own language. It's very weighty. And then that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of physical and sexual abuse. And this is this podcast, if you're a podcaster like I am, this podcast, there's a couple different seasons that follow different topics. But in the second season of Stolen, it's called Surviving St. Michael's. And the woman who is producing the podcast, this is a very personal story for her, because her father, when he was a young boy in residential school, and this residential boarding schools were still happening up until I believe about the 1960s. So that's not that far away from today. But the story is about him as a little boy and his experiences in boarding schools, and he was sexually abused, and how to come to terms with all of that, and how healing had to take place for her and her family. But yeah, I highly recommend this podcast. It's excellent. It is a very hard thing to listen to, but it is incredibly well done. And then this last piece, you know, in terms of boarding schools, the food, this is something I hadn't considered. This book here on the right is a relative of mine, Mona Susan Power. I recently read this book like within the past like month or so, and it's an incredible read. It follows 3 generations of women, 2 of which had gone to boarding schools. So this gives you a more clear picture of exactly what's going on here. But one thing that I had never considered before until I read this book was that the food would have been so different for these students. And in the book, she speaks about a girl who was from like the Alaskan territories and was forced into the boarding school, and you know, she was essentially starving because you know, she couldn't, like, physically couldn't tolerate the food because she was used to eating, you know, salmon and fish and you know, foods local to her, you know, to her area. And you know, that just really, it really hit me hard, because I hadn't considered that before, that you know, a lot of these students, this was not their traditional food source. And as somebody who has my own you know, my own GI issues or whatever, I could completely empathize with how that would be so hard and so traumatizing to a student who's just trying to survive. So we're going to turn now. Sorry, I know this is a little bit heavy here. Like I said, it's, you know, it can be a lot, but I do want to talk a little bit about my family and my family's relationship to boarding schools. So I try to lay out a a little bit of a family tree here. So Krogos would be kind of the patriarch, I guess you could say. And I know for a fact that Mason Jones, Morgan Krogos, and Theodore Jones all attended residential boarding schools. My great-grandfather is William Jones, and that's the part that, those are the pieces that I'm missing. I am almost certain he would have gone to residential schools, but I don't, as would my great-grandmother, but I can't find those records. And that's the hard piece of using archives to help with that genealogy work. Is just sometimes you run into brick walls, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I did want to start with Mason Jones. I'll talk a little bit about some of the experiences and how I've come across some records. This is an image of the Hampton Institute, the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. This is in Virginia. When Mason Jones was about 15 years old, he had entered school here. And what I've found from records and from other people's work, people have written about this. He had attended government schools in North Dakota, like Fort Stevenson, and in Elbowswood as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but he was there, let's see, I think he worked as he worked in carpentry. He was taught carpentry skills and greenhouse skills. He had a lot of work outings, which I'll talk about in an upcoming slide to give you a little bit more context about that. And let's see, so I guess there's not a whole lot to really say here, other than I was just able to identify that there are records here. One of the things that you'll run into is like you'll see with Carlisle. Carlisle has a really great digital resource of locating student records. But other institutions, and as some of you may know, you know, when you're running these archives, a lot of times you're running on really, as in any other organization, workforce area, a lot of us are running on skeleton crews. We are very, very limited in our resources and the number of people working. I know that from my personal experience. And I just wanted to say that, we, so I'll say one institution of trying to get some of these records, they are currently not taking any requests at this time, just due to like staffing changes and transition within the museum or organization that the repository, the archive that holds these materials. And that's something that can be really hard in terms of making these records accessible. Like this is my this is my family, and I can't have access to these records at this time. And as an archivist myself, I understand, knowing what it's like to have a short, limited staff. But, I think something, and this isn't a problem for us to solve here, but, that's something that needs to be considered is how do we make these records more accessible to Native people who are just trying to, connect with what we have left of our families. So this is one example of an archival record. This is from Carlisle. So I mentioned Morgan Krogost. You'll see here his home address is with Mason Jones. They were brothers. And, it shows that his father, Krogost, was living, and then his mother has died. And these records I should talk a little bit about can be traumatizing as you're working with them. I don't know if any of you out there are big into genealogy. There's some really, really great resources, but sometimes I guess it should be said outside of indigenous, related records, sometimes you come across things that you don't expect to find, and it can be really hard. So it's always, when you're working with primary sources and these sort of records, you have to do so with care and just kind of prepare yourself for what you may find. And this record isn't particularly bad. I do find it interesting that it says that his vision is half in his right eye. But what I wanted to point out here is the things that can be kind of hard to look at is that what you see here are a list of patron names and dates. And another piece to residential boarding schools is that they would, when they would break for summer or for the time in between academic years, students were essentially not allowed to go home to their people because they didn't want them to be refamiliarized with their culture, to pick the language back up. So they would be sent to families, fairly close distance of the school. So you can see here that Mason was sent to New Jersey and some other places in Pennsylvania for the majority of his time while he was at Carlisle. And let's see, what you can't see here, I should have included an image of it, is down at the bottom. It tells you that he was in school for, looks like 70 months before entering Carlisle. So he entered Carlisle in 5th grade. And then it says at the bottom, his religious organization was Episcopalian. And that's the part that I think is funny because Mason Jones is my great grandfather's father. And I'd mentioned that William Jones, my great grandfather, was a minister. And I was always under the assumption that he was a Baptist minister, but this Episcopalian part of this record really just kind of threw me off. So, again, I wish I had my mom or my great grandma to ask those questions too. But, here we are in this genealogy search just keeps, just continues. But so this is another example of an archival record. This is the Carlisle Arrow, which is a newspaper that's printed by students at the school. I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint for just a second because I want to be able to show you the actual record itself here, because Morgan Krogost is also mentioned in this newspaper. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit for you. Okay, see, well, for the sake of time, I'm just gonna read it to you. There's a little section in here that I thought was interesting because it says that, all right, some students, including Morgan Krogost and Joe Libby, were put up in the front of ruled blackboards. And then Libby read off at a fair speed 3 or 4 sentences about the value of integrity of business. And these were written down in shorthand, which were then read off to the typewriter chorus, which transcribed them neatly and speedily. And then it goes on to say 2 of the graduating members, Sarah Hoaxie and Evelyn Pierce, showed how the stagnant mind of the just caught Indian boy is wakened. And so it sounds like they're doing some sort of exercise here where they, are doing some sort of like writing drill or typewriting drill in the classroom. But it was just how the stagnant mind of the just caught Indian boy is wakened really just kind of struck a chord with me. It again reiterates this need to, to assimilate these students. And, like I said, a lot of times when you're working with these records, it can just be so moving and powerful. And so the other thing that I was not expecting to find, this was a recent discovery of mine. I have help from other archivists, who have knowledge of different collections. She was able to give me several documents relating to Morgan Krogos, but not this one. As I was searching through the Carlisle archives, I found this photo. I'd never seen this photo before, but this is Morgan Krogos here. He graduated in 1908 and then went on back home and worked in different industries, different things to do to help the tribe, but, had been fully assimilated at this point. And then lastly, this one, hate to end on a sad note, but to kind of drive the point home of just how difficult boarding school trauma was for Native peoples is that this is a death certificate of Theodore Jones, who would have been the younger brother of William Jones, my great grandpa. And I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see a few things. So the story that I was told by my mother was that, he would have been 15 years old at this time, that he was running away from boarding school. And he was with my great grandfather, and they had made it back to, let's see, it says it on here. I believe it's McLean County, but had made it, fairly close to home, had not made it home, because you can see that it says length of residence in the town where the death occurred was only 10 minutes. And what the story was that he was on a horse, and they were walking through a river, like through, a stream or a river of some sort, and he had fallen off the horse, but his foot got stuck in the stirrup, and he drowned. And, it's just, just one of the many stories like that of students, not making it back home. So it's very powerful stuff. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna move a little bit into some of the resources, and then I'll be open for questions. But there's a documentary that just came out recently. This is done through National Geographic. It's called Sugarcane. I have not yet seen it. It was in theaters like maybe in August. And so I believe shortly it should be, again, since it's National Geographic, should be streaming probably on Hulu, but also Disney Plus. So if you're interested, it's very powerful. This is where they have a lot of Native people, elderly people speaking about their experiences. So I'm very curious to watch it myself, but I hope that, like I said, listing some of these resources, you engage with some of this material. And then the other thing is that very recently in July, the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, which is done by the government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, just recently came out with its second investigative report. And it, if you're interested in reading it, it's out there for you to look at. It's a long document, but it really, really goes into the in-depth of what boarding schools were like. It talks about the children there. The one shocking statistic that came out of there's about 1,000 students that died while they were in boarding schools. And I'm sure, you know, that number will continue to increase as more reporting and investigating are done. But then lastly, I did want to make you aware of this for those of you that are interested in kind of furthering your knowledge about this. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition was established, I believe, like back in 2012, but I feel like in the recent years, especially with more legislation and these reports that are coming out, there's, you know, a lot that can be done here. You can join by becoming a member to help in this advocacy, and it's free. You don't have to, you know, there's no fee to join, but it's a good way to be an advocate for those that are interested in getting involved and helping heal here, right? So I thought this was prevalent to share here. This is you know, as we said, Indigenous Peoples Day is tomorrow, I believe, officially. And then the month of November is National Native American Heritage Month. So I found this through the National Institute of Health. There's a lot of ways that you can be an ally. And a lot of the things that we talked about today is how you can support tribes, you know, how you can avoid appropriation, keep the conversation going as you've brought me here today, and to, you know, engage and celebrate Native Americans today. So I thought this was important to share. And this QR code, I know many of you are watching from your phones, so this might be difficult to do. This is a list of resources that I put together that it links to a bunch of organizations in areas that you can support, volunteer, donate time and money to. And like I said, I will get this information to Carol. And then, yeah, and actually, like, real quick, before I jump back to that, this is what I was mentioning earlier, this kind of infographic list of resources. So like different media, books, podcasts, organization, and resources if you'd like to further educate yourself, and anything that I didn't cover today, that if you're interested in taking a look, you know, it's there, and I'll make sure that gets to Carol as well. But that's what I have for you today. I'm sorry, I know it's very heavy topic, but yes, I'm open to questions. Michael, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much, and I will recognize Michael because we really only have time for one or two comments. You've given us so much, and wow, this is really relevant. Let's have Michael. We welcome you, and maybe at this point you could stop sharing the screen, or could you got
Yes.
covered?
Yeah.
Sure.
Janine, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I know we're short on time. I just want to say one thing. There's a lot of pushback against talking honestly about American history and what's gone on. You know, people talk about, you know, not being woke, or, you know, they use the term DEIS in a pejorative way. And I'm curious, we mostly talk about that in the context of, you know, African American, possibly Hispanic, but I haven't really thought about it in terms of Native Americans. And I was wondering if you might speak to that, if you guys are getting pushback as well.
I would say not so much within Native communities that I've experienced, but more so on a university level. There's a lot of pushback. I'm sure some of you've read about the legislation that they're passing in Texas that you can't even mention DEI. You know, so yes, I believe we were in very interesting times. You know, like I said, I haven't personally received pushback. I don't know many Native people that are receiving. Well, and I actually know I can't say that. The Black Hills in North Dakota, North and South Dakota, the Black Hills are very sacred to the Lakota people, and there is a lot of pushback about, you know, that's like where, you know, Mount Rushmore is, and you know, there's a lot of claim over that land. There's some really great documentaries about that as well, the Lakota Nation versus the United States, that speaks more to that. But yeah, I mean, I think we are all kind of dealing with pushback in many facets of our life. I know that probably doesn't answer the question accurately, but yeah, I think there's pushback everywhere. And I think part of what I try to do is try to educate and hope that it keeps that conversation going, and that maybe we can change some minds and hearts.
We have time for one more question, and Janine, you've given so much to this presentation, for which I'm so grateful. And we will have the recording as well as the resources that you've given us, because really we're just in some ways beginning. Bonnie Holcomb here has a question for you.
Thank you very much, Janine. I listened to her presentation and then arrived at the church, so I'm here in the room now. I'm very grateful for the wealth of information that you've given us, and I think the issue of education reaches globally. I mean, these kinds of restrictions and this kind of discrimination and land grab is occurring around the world. And as we know, and as we acknowledge what we've done in the United States, we can be consistent in applying whatever lessons learned here abroad. So we hope to be in touch with you and really appreciate the kind of rich resources you've provided to us. I hope we can stay in touch with you about this.
Yes, please do.
We will do our best to really follow through on a number of these areas and try to keep you informed about. You've spurred us, I think, to take some action, and we'll talk to you about land management and other decisions we might make.
Yes, please do. I'm happy to consult, bounce ideas off of.
70th year of our church, we're celebrating, but we're also acknowledging and our own history and what we have. And you've given so much to that. You really I can tell the time and the effort and the spirit.
Yes, thank you.
That you have shared with us, and we so appreciate that. As time passes and we get closer to the election, it's important for us to stay together and to stay in contact and in communication with each other. Next Sunday, Bob Deans will be joining us, who's former president of the White House Correspondents and Association, and just a great facilitator of discussion. And not only will he be talking to us, but he'll be talking with us as we exchange. And I really hope that as many of us as you can will join us as we talk about faith, witness, and democracy. So thank you so much. And thank you, Janine.
Yes, thank you. And you have my email address. Please, if you didn't have if you have questions that I couldn't get to, please, please reach out.
So beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I spent my college summers as part of the theater company at the Black Hills Playhouse. And
really?
know all
Oh
about what
my
she's talking
goodness.
about. It was great.
I mean, I was a social studies teacher, and I taught, the history, and just began to uncover things.
Yeah.
And as Gina was telling me, they've now finally digitized all the treaties. But at that point in time, I was getting these resources. I mean, I was scared to touch things because we hadn't touched it. The Library of Congress had these books, and it's amazing. So, we've got a lot to spin around about.
Yeah, sorry, I'm giving you a lot.
Yeah, right.
Sorry for such a heavy topic, but I think it's important and worth it.
Yeah,
Carol, do you want us to put these chairs away?
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please stay in touch, everyone.
Yeah.
Do you want us to put the chairs away?
Yes.